The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, yellowed with age and bearing the official seal of Morrison Associates law firm. Daniel Hartwell turned it over in his calloused hands, his name written in elegant script across cream-colored paper that felt foreign against his work-worn fingers. He had been expecting another bill, another notice of overdue payment, another reminder of how far behind he had fallen. Instead, he found himself staring at words that seemed to belong in someone else's life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dear Mr. Hartwell, we regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Ezra Hartwell. As his sole remaining heir, you have inherited his property located at 1847 Industrial Boulevard, including all buildings, equipment, and contents therein. Daniel read the words 3 times before they began to sink in. Great-uncle Ezra. He could barely remember the man, just a vague recollection of a stern figure at family gatherings decades ago, someone the adults whispered about in hushed tones. The factory had been abandoned for 20 years, a rusting monument to better times that had long since passed. Everyone in Millbrook knew about the old Hartwell Manufacturing plant, with its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, a place where teenagers dared each other to venture after dark. But what Daniel couldn't have known, as he stood in his cramped apartment kitchen with peeling linoleum and a refrigerator held shut by duct tape, was that this inheritance would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The mockery, the judgment, the unexpected discovery that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone who had written him off as nothing more than a failure. The law office of Morrison Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, much like everything else in Millbrook. Daniel climbed the narrow staircase, his secondhand suit hanging loose on his thin frame, bought from a thrift store the night before, with the last $40 from his checking account. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs and other people's dreams. Margaret Morrison, the senior partner, was a woman in her 70s whose sharp eyes seemed to catalog every detail of Daniel's appearance the moment he walked through her door. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her desk was meticulously organized, every paper in its proper place. She gestured to a worn leather chair across from her mahogany desk, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Hartwell," she began, her voice carrying the weight of years spent delivering news both good and bad. "I must say, your great-uncle was quite specific in his instructions regarding this inheritance." She pulled out a thick folder, the edges softened with age, and placed it between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in the chair, which creaked under even his modest weight. At 34, he looked older than his years. The result of too many 12-hour shifts at the loading dock. Too many nights lying awake wondering how he would make rent. Too many mornings staring at his reflection and seeing his father's disappointed eyes looking back at him. "I have to be honest, Mrs. Morrison," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why Uncle Ezra would leave me anything. We barely knew each other. The last time I saw him, I was maybe 10 years old." Margaret's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional facade. "Your great-uncle was a complicated man, Mr. Hartwell. He kept to himself for the last 20 years of his life, rarely spoke to family, never married, no children of his own. But he was very clear about his wishes." She opened the folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper, covered in Ezra's distinctive handwriting. He left specific instructions that the property was to go to you, and only you, upon his death. The factory building stretched before them like a sleeping giant, its red brick facade darkened by decades of weather and neglect. Broken windows stared out like empty eye sockets, and weeds had pushed through cracks in the concrete foundation, creating a wild garden of dandelions and chicory that swayed in the afternoon breeze. The sign that once proudly announced Hartwell Manufacturing quality since 1952 now hung at a dejected angle, most of the letters faded or missing entirely. Daniel stood at the rusted chain-link fence, his hands wrapped around the cold metal links, and tried to imagine what this place had been like in its heyday. Margaret had given him the keys, heavy iron things that looked like they belonged in a medieval castle, along with a folder full of documents he didn't fully understand. Property taxes, maintenance records, inspection reports that painted a picture of steady decline and systematic abandonment. "This is it," he murmured to himself, his breath visible in the cool autumn air. This is what I inherited. The main building was enormous, at least 50,000 square feet, with loading docks along one side and what appeared to be office space along the front. Smaller outbuildings dotted the property, some connected by covered walkways, others standing alone like forgotten sentinels. The entire complex was surrounded by nearly 10 acres of overgrown land, most of it hidden behind the abandoned structures. As Daniel fumbled with the lock on the main entrance, his phone buzzed with a text message from his sister, Sarah. "Mom told me about the factory. Are you seriously going to waste time on that dump? You should sell it for scrap and pay off your debts." He stared at the message for a long moment before sliding the phone back into his pocket without responding. Sarah had always been the successful one, the one who went to college, who married a lawyer, who lived in a house with a 2-car garage and sent Christmas cards with professional family photos. She had never missed an opportunity to remind Daniel of his failures, and this inheritance seemed to be just another chance for her to point out his poor judgment. The door finally gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty space beyond. Daniel stepped inside and was immediately hit by the smell of old machinery, rust, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the cavernous space. The factory floor was still filled with equipment, massive machines covered in canvas tarps that had long since collected their own layer of dust and debris. Conveyor belts snaked between workstations, frozen mid-task, as if the workers had simply walked away one day and never returned. In many ways, that was exactly what had happened. Daniel walked slowly through the space, his footsteps echoing off the high ceiling. He could almost hear the phantom sounds of the factory in operation. The whir of machinery, the hiss of pneumatic systems, the voices of workers calling to each other across the floor. His great-uncle had built something here, had created jobs for hundreds of people, had been part of the beating heart of Millbrook's economy. What had gone wrong? Margaret had mentioned something about foreign competition, changing markets, the usual story of American manufacturing in the late 20th century. But standing here now, surrounded by the bones of industrial ambition, Daniel felt the weight of that failure pressing down on him like a physical force. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed his brother-in-law Rick's name, and Daniel almost didn't answer. Rick was Sarah's husband, a successful corporate lawyer who had never missed an opportunity to point out Daniel's shortcomings, usually with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Danny boy!" Rick's voice boomed through the speaker with false enthusiasm. "Sarah told me about your big inheritance. Congratulations, you're now the proud owner of Millbrook's most expensive eyesore." Daniel could hear Sarah laughing in the background, and the sound cut through him like a blade. "It's not that bad, Rick. I'm just taking a look around." "Oh, come on, Daniel. We both know what this is. Your uncle stuck you with a white elephant. Probably cost more in back taxes than it's worth. You should sell it to a demolition company and take whatever you can get. Hell, maybe they'll even pay you to haul away the scrap metal." "I'm just exploring my options," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's a big property. Maybe there's potential here." Rick's laughter was sharp and unforgiving. "Potential? Danny, you've been working at a loading dock for 10 years. What do you know about real estate development or running a business? This isn't some feel-good movie where the underdog saves the day. This is real life. And in real life, guys like you don't suddenly become successful entrepreneurs." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth, or at least the truth as Daniel had always known it. He was the family failure, the one who had dropped out of community college, who had never held a job for more than a few years, who lived paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment with a Murphy bed and a hot plate. What business did he have dreaming of anything more? "I have to go, Rick," Daniel said quietly. "I'll talk to you later." "Just remember what I said, Danny. Don't let pride make you do something stupid. Cut your losses and move on." Daniel ended the call and stood in the silence of the abandoned factory, surrounded by the ghosts of productivity and purpose. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the western windows, casting long shadows across the factory floor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In a few hours, it would be dark, and he would have to leave this place and return to his real life, to the loading dock and the studio apartment, and the constant weight of other people's expectations. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might have been like to belong to something larger than himself. To be part of a legacy, even one that had ultimately failed. To have his name on a building, on a business, on something that mattered to the world beyond his own small existence. He walked deeper into the factory, past rows of covered machinery and stacks of raw materials that had been sitting untouched for 2 decades. Near the back of the building, he found a staircase leading to what appeared to be the administrative offices. The steps were solid oak, built to last, though covered now with the same layer of dust that seemed to coat everything in this forgotten place. The office level was divided into several rooms, a reception area with a desk that still held a 1998 calendar, individual offices for managers and supervisors, and, at the end of the hall, a corner office that must have belonged to Ezra himself. The nameplate on the door was tarnished but still readable. E. Hartwell, President. Daniel pushed open the door and stepped into his great-uncle's private domain. Unlike the factory floor below, this room had been carefully maintained, as if Ezra had continued to use it long after the manufacturing operations had ceased. The desk was clear, except for a leather blotter and an antique fountain pen in a silver holder. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with technical manuals, business texts, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of industry publications. Behind the desk, a large window offered a view of the entire factory complex and the town of Millbrook beyond. From this vantage point, Daniel could see the residential neighborhoods where he had grown up, the main street with its struggling businesses and empty storefronts, the railroad tracks that had once carried goods to and from the factory, but now served only the occasional freight train passing through to somewhere more important. This had been Ezra's kingdom, his view of the world he had built and ultimately lost. Daniel tried to imagine what it must have been like to sit in this chair, to look out over a thriving operation, to know that hundreds of families depended on the decisions made in this room. The weight of that responsibility seemed overwhelming, especially for someone like Daniel, who had never been responsible for anything more significant than making sure the loading dock was clear at the end of his shift. As he settled into Ezra's chair, Daniel noticed a framed photograph on the credenza behind the desk. It showed a much younger Ezra standing in front of the factory, surrounded by workers in coveralls and hard hats. Everyone in the photo was smiling, their faces bright, with the satisfaction of honest work and steady wages. The picture was dated 1987, just a few years before everything began to fall apart. Daniel picked up the photograph and studied the faces, wondering if any of these people were still alive, still living in Millbrook, still remembering the days when the Hartwell factory was the center of the local economy. How many of them had been forced to find new jobs when the plant closed? How many had left town entirely, following opportunities to other places, other lives? The sound of his phone ringing again broke the spell of the moment. This time it was his mother, and Daniel knew the conversation would be more of the same. Family dinner on Sunday, where Sarah and Rick would hold court, telling stories about their successful friends and their expensive vacations, while Daniel sat quietly and tried to avoid talking about his own life. "Hello, Mom." "Daniel, honey, Sarah told me about this factory business. I hope you're not getting your hopes up about something that's probably going to cost you more money than you have." His mother's voice carried the same note of concerned pessimism that had colored most of their conversations for the past 15 years. She loved him, he knew that. But she had long ago stopped believing that he was capable of surprising her with success. "I'm just taking a look around, Mom. Trying to understand what Uncle Ezra left me. Your great-uncle was always a bit eccentric, dear. Remember how he used to sit by himself at family gatherings, hardly talking to anyone? I always thought there was something off about him, the way he lived alone in that big house, never married, never seemed to have any friends." Daniel remembered those family gatherings differently. He remembered Ezra as quiet, yes, but not unfriendly. There had been something in his great-uncle's eyes, a sadness that Daniel had recognized even as a child, though he hadn't understood it then. Maybe Ezra had simply been tired, worn down by the weight of responsibility and the slow realization that the world was changing in ways that would leave him behind. "I should probably get going, Mom. It's getting dark and I want to lock everything up properly. Just promise me you won't do anything rash, Daniel. You have a steady job at the loading dock. It may not be glamorous, but it pays the bills. Don't throw that away for some fantasy about bringing back a dead factory." "I promise I'll be careful," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. After ending the call, Daniel sat in the gathering darkness of Ezra's office, watching the lights of Millbrook begin to twinkle to life in the distance. Somewhere out there, Sarah and Rick were probably having dinner in their beautiful dining room, discussing his foolishness and placing bets on how long it would take him to come to his senses. His mother was probably already planning the conversation she would have with him on Sunday, gently but firmly explaining why he should sell the property and use whatever money he got to pay down his credit card debt. They weren't wrong. Exactly. Daniel had no experience running a business, no capital to invest, no particular skills that would qualify him to take on such a massive undertaking. The rational thing to do would be to list the property with a real estate agent, take whatever offer came along, and use the proceeds to stabilize his financial situation. But as he sat in Ezra's chair, looking out over the complex that had once employed half the town, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Not certainty, not confidence, but this simple, powerful feeling that maybe, just maybe, his life could be something more than what it had been. The drive back to his apartment took him through the heart of Millbrook's downtown, past the closed shops and the struggling businesses that were trying to hold on in an economy that had never fully recovered from the factory's closure. The pizza palace, where he sometimes splurged on a Friday night dinner. The laundromat, where he spent Sunday afternoons reading paperback novels while his clothes tumbled in machines that were older than he was. The convenience store, where Mrs. Chen always asked about his family and never seemed to judge him for buying generic brands and day-old bread. These were his people, Daniel realized. Not Sarah and Rick with their professional friends and their country club memberships, but the working people of Millbrook who understood what it meant to stretch a dollar, to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries, to dream of something better while accepting that dreams didn't always come true. What if the factory could matter again? What if there was a way to bring back those jobs, to give people a reason to stay in Millbrook instead of leaving for bigger cities and better opportunities? What if Ezra had seen something in Daniel that Daniel had never seen in himself? The questions followed him up the narrow stairs to his apartment, past the broken mailboxes and the flickering fluorescent light in the hallway. They were still with him as he heated up a can of soup on his hot plate and ate it while standing at the window that looked out over the alley behind his building. They haunted his dreams that night, mixing with images of the abandoned factory and his great-uncle's sad, knowing eyes. The next morning brought a return to reality in the form of his alarm clock and the necessity of getting to work on time. The loading dock waited for no one, and Daniel couldn't afford to lose his job, inheritance or no inheritance. But even as he went through the motions of his regular routine, checking in pallets and directing truck drivers to the appropriate bays, his mind kept drifting back to the factory and the feeling of sitting in Ezra's chair. During his lunch break, he found himself researching manufacturing businesses on his phone, reading about small companies that had found niche markets, family businesses that had adapted to changing times, success stories of entrepreneurs who had started with nothing and built something meaningful. Most of the stories were inspiring but vague on the practical details of how such transformations actually happened. "Daydreaming about your factory, Danny?" Daniel looked up to see Mike Kowalski, one of his coworkers, settling onto the picnic table beside him with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. Mike was in his 50s, a veteran of the loading dock who had been working there since before Daniel was hired. He had the weathered look of a man who had spent decades doing physical labor, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "Word gets around fast in a small town," Daniel said with a rueful smile. "Sarah's been telling everyone who'll listen about your inheritance," Mike said, putting air quotes around the word. "She seems to think you've lost your mind." "Maybe I have. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with a dead factory. Everyone keeps telling me to sell it, take whatever I can get and move on." Mike unwrapped his sandwich thoughtfully, taking his time before responding. "You know, I worked at that factory for 15 years before it closed. Started there right out of high school, worked my way up to shift supervisor. Best job I ever had." Daniel felt a spark of interest. "What was it like? When it was running, I mean." "It was something," Mike said, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. 3 shifts, 7 days a week, making automotive parts for companies all over the Midwest. Good wages, decent benefits, profit sharing at the end of the year. Your great uncle, he was tough but fair, knew every worker by name, remembered their kids' birthdays, showed up at funerals when somebody's family was hurting. What happened? I mean, I know it closed, but why? Mike was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the loading dock where trucks waited to be unloaded. Lot of factors. Foreign competition, mostly. Companies could get the same parts made overseas for half the cost. Ezra tried to adapt, invested in new equipment, tried to find new markets, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. By the end, he was running the place at a loss, keeping it open just to preserve the jobs. That must have been hard on him. Broke his heart, I think. The day he announced the closure, I saw him standing in his office window, looking down at all of us like he was apologizing for something that wasn't really his fault. A lot of guys were angry, felt like he'd let them down, but I understood. Sometimes the world changes, and there's not much you can do about it. Daniel thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, and it was still on his mind when he drove back to the factory that evening. He had told himself he was just going to take another look around, maybe start making a list of what would need to be done to make the property sellable. But as he walked through the empty spaces again, he found himself seeing not just the decay and abandonment, but the bones of something that had once been vital and important. In the corner of the main floor, he discovered something he had missed the day before, a small area that had been set up as a museum of sorts, with display cases containing examples of the parts the factory had produced, photographs of the manufacturing process, and newspaper clippings documenting the plant's history. Someone, probably Ezra, had taken the time to preserve the story of what had happened here. One of the newspaper articles was from the Millbrook Gazette, dated 6 months before the plant's closure. The headline read, "Hartwell Manufacturing Fights to Stay Competitive," and the accompanying article described Ezra's efforts to modernize the operation and find new markets for the factory's products. There was a photograph of Ezra standing next to a piece of new equipment, his expression determined but tired. Local businessman Ezra Hartwell remains optimistic about the future of his family's manufacturing operation, the article quoted him as saying. "We've been part of this community for nearly 50 years, and we're not giving up without a fight." But they had given up eventually. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that they had been defeated by forces beyond their control. Daniel wondered what it must have been like for Ezra to make that final decision, to accept that the fight was over, and that the best thing he could do for his employees was to let them find jobs elsewhere. As he continued exploring the property, Daniel began to notice details that suggested the factory had been more than just a place of business. There was a small kitchen area where workers had apparently eaten their lunches, with tables and chairs still arranged as if waiting for the next shift to arrive. A bulletin board still held notices about company picnics, softball leagues, and retirement parties, faded now but still readable. Near the main entrance, he found a memorial plaque dedicated to employees who had died while working at the plant, their names engraved in bronze with dates stretching back to the 1950s. These people had spent their lives here, had raised families on the wages they earned within these walls, had been part of something larger than themselves. The weight of that history was almost overwhelming. Daniel had inherited more than just a building and some old equipment. He had inherited the dreams and disappointments of hundreds of people, the economic hopes of an entire community, the legacy of a man who had tried to hold on to something precious in a world that no longer valued it. Standing in the gathering darkness of the factory floor, surrounded by the ghosts of industrial ambition, Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 48 hours earlier. He wasn't going to sell the factory, at least not yet. He was going to try to understand what Ezra had seen in him, what potential his great-uncle had recognized that everyone else, including Daniel himself, had missed. It was probably a mistake. It was almost certainly a mistake. But for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Hartwell was going to bet on himself even if nobody else would. The following Tuesday marked the beginning of what Daniel would later recognize as the most challenging period of his life. He had requested a week of vacation time from the loading dock, using up his entire annual allotment in one stretch, something that raised eyebrows among his co-workers and earned him a lecture from his supervisor about the importance of planning ahead. "You sure about this, Hartwell?" Joe Martinez, the dock foreman, had asked while signing the vacation request. "This is all the time off you get for the year. What if you need it for something important later?" Daniel had wanted to explain that this was the most important thing he had ever done, but the words seemed too big for the moment. Instead, he had simply nodded and promised to be back the following Monday, knowing, even as he said it, that he might be lying. Armed with a legal pad, a handful of pens, and a determination that felt both thrilling and terrifying, Daniel began his systematic exploration of the Hartwell Manufacturing complex. What he discovered over the next several days challenged everything he thought he knew about his great-uncle and the business that had once been the heartbeat of Millbrook. The factory was larger than he had initially realized, with sections that extended deep into the property, connected by a network of corridors and walkways that formed a maze of industrial purpose. Some areas were completely dark, their windows boarded up or painted black, while others still received natural light through skylights that had somehow survived decades of neglect. In what appeared to be the original section of the building, dating back to the 1950s, Daniel found evidence of the factory's humble beginnings. The machinery here was older, simpler, designed for basic manufacturing processes that had been cutting edge when Eisenhower was president. Workbenches bore the scars of decades of use, with tool marks and stains that told the story of craftsmen who had taken pride in their work. But as he moved through the facility, following the logical progression of the manufacturing process, Daniel could see how Ezra had continuously invested in modernization. Newer sections housed sophisticated equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, computer-controlled machines that could perform complex operations with precision that would have been impossible for human hands alone. The contrast was striking and poignant. Here was a man who had refused to let his business stagnate, who had poured money and effort into staying competitive, who had fought against obsolescence with every tool at his disposal. The fact that he had ultimately failed made his efforts seem even more heroic, like a last stand against forces too powerful to overcome. On his third day of exploration, Daniel made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a stack of supply boxes in what appeared to be a storage room, he found a door marked Private Archives. The key that opened it was on the ring Margaret Morrison had given him, though it took him several tries to find the right one. The room beyond contained filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, meticulously organized and labeled, with dates going back to the founding of the company. But more importantly, it contained Ezra's personal records, the documents that told the real story of Hartwell Manufacturing, and the man who had dedicated his life to keeping it alive. Daniel pulled files at random, spreading their contents across a table that dominated the center of the room. What he found painted a picture of a business that had been far more successful than anyone in Millbrook had realized. Financial records showed that at its peak in the 1980s, Hartwell Manufacturing had generated annual revenues in excess of $50 million, employing over 400 people, and maintaining contracts with major automotive manufacturers throughout the Midwest. But the files also revealed the crushing pressure that foreign competition had brought to bear on American manufacturing. Letters from longtime customers apologetically explained that they were moving their business overseas, where the same products could be produced for a fraction of the cost. Ezra's responses to these letters were professional but increasingly desperate, offering concessions and compromises that ate away at the company's profit margins until there was nothing left. One letter, dated just 6 months before the plant's closure, was particularly heartbreaking. It was from the CEO of a company that had been buying parts from Hartwell Manufacturing for over 20 years, explaining that they had no choice but to switch to a Chinese supplier who could provide the same components for 60% less money. "Please understand, Ezra," the letter read. "This decision brings me no joy. Your company has been a valued partner for decades, and the quality of your work has always been exceptional. But in today's market, we simply cannot afford to pay American prices when our competitors are taking advantage of overseas production. I hope you can find other customers who value what you bring to the table." Ezra's response, found in a carbon copy file, was dignified but defeated. "I understand your position, Jim, and I don't blame you for making the decision that's best for your company. We've had a good run together, and I'm grateful for all the years of partnership. I just hope that someday, American manufacturing will find a way to compete again." As Daniel read through more files, he began to understand the true scope of his great-uncle's struggle. Ezra hadn't simply given up when times got tough. He had spent nearly a decade fighting a losing battle, using his personal savings to keep the factory running, taking out loans against his house and other properties, selling off assets piece by piece to maintain operations for as long as possible. The personal cost had been enormous, Medical records showed that Ezra had suffered from stress-related health problems throughout the 1990s, including high blood pressure, insomnia, and what his doctor had diplomatically described as nervous exhaustion. Bank statements revealed that he had liquidated his retirement accounts, cashed in life insurance policies, and borrowed against everything he owned in a desperate attempt to save the jobs of people who depended on him. But perhaps the most revealing documents were the letters Ezra had written but never sent, drafts of correspondence that showed the depth of his anguish over the factory's closure. In one, addressed to his employees, he had written, "I know that many of you feel I have let you down, and I cannot argue with that assessment. When my father handed this business over to me, he made me promise to take care of the people who worked here, to treat them as family, to never forget that their livelihoods depended on the decisions I made. I have failed in that promise, and I will carry that failure with me for the rest of my life." Another letter, apparently intended for the local newspaper but never submitted, contained Ezra's analysis of what the factory's closure would mean for Millbrook. The loss of Hartwell Manufacturing will ripple through this community in ways that most people cannot yet imagine. The 400 jobs that will disappear represent not just individual hardships, but the collapse of an entire economic ecosystem. Local businesses that depend on our employees' spending will suffer. Property values will decline as people are forced to move away in search of work. The tax base that has supported our schools and municipal services will shrink, creating a spiral of decline that could take decades to reverse. His predictions had proven to be tragically accurate. In the 20 years since the factory closed, Millbrook's population had dropped by nearly 30%. Main Street was lined with empty storefronts, and the few businesses that remained struggled to survive in an economy that had never recovered from the loss of its primary industry. But as Daniel continued reading through Ezra's files, he discovered something that made his hands tremble with excitement. Hidden in a folder marked Future Projects were detailed plans for a revolutionary manufacturing process that Ezra had been developing in the years before the plant closed. The plans were incredibly sophisticated, involving advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, and production techniques that seemed decades ahead of their time. More importantly, the plans included financial projections that suggested this new process could produce automotive components at costs competitive with overseas manufacturers, while maintaining the quality standards that had made American manufacturing legendary. Ezra had apparently spent years developing this system, working with engineers and computer programmers to create what he believed could be the salvation of American industry. According to the documentation, Ezra had invested over $2 million of his own money in developing the prototypes and testing the process. The results had been promising, with early trials showing that the new system could reduce production costs by nearly 40% while actually improving quality and consistency. But the project had been abandoned when the factory closed, the prototypes mothballed, and the research files relegated to storage. Ezra had run out of money and time before he could bring his vision to full fruition, leaving behind what appeared to be the foundation for a manufacturing revolution that had never happened. Daniel spent hours poring over the technical specifications, trying to understand the implications of what he had discovered. While much of the engineering detail was beyond his comprehension, the business case was clear. If Ezra's process actually worked as designed, it could represent a competitive advantage worth millions of dollars. But more than that, it could represent hope for Millbrook and communities like it across the American Rust Belt. If domestic manufacturing could truly compete with overseas production on both cost and quality, it might be possible to bring back the kind of jobs that had once formed the backbone of the American economy. The discovery left Daniel both exhilarated and overwhelmed. He had come to the factory expecting to find nothing more than scrap metal and real estate value. Instead, he had stumbled upon what might be the answer to a problem that had plagued American manufacturing for decades. The question was whether he, with his limited education and complete lack of business experience, could possibly hope to understand and implement something so complex. That evening, Daniel called the one person he knew who might be able to help him make sense of what he had found. Professor Elena Vasquez had been his favorite teacher during his brief stint at Millbrook Community College, an engineering instructor who had seen potential in Daniel that he had never recognized in himself. "Daniel Hartwell," she said when she answered the phone, her voice warm with surprise. "I haven't heard from you in years. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, Professor Vasquez. Actually, I'm calling because I've run into something that's way over my head, and I was hoping you might be willing to take a look at some technical documents for me." Of course, Daniel. What kind of documents are we talking about? Daniel tried to explain the situation without sounding completely insane, describing the inheritance, the abandoned factory, and the discovery of Ezra's research files. Professor Vasquez listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds that suggested she was taking him seriously. This sounds fascinating, Daniel. I'd be very interested to see what your great-uncle was working on. Advanced manufacturing processes are exactly the kind of thing that could revolutionize American industry, if the technology is as promising as you're describing. They arranged to meet the following morning at the factory, and Daniel spent the rest of the evening organizing the most important documents and trying to prepare himself for what might be either validation or devastating disappointment. Professor Vasquez arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, driving a small hybrid car that looked out of place in the industrial setting of the factory complex. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. Daniel had always admired her combination of technical expertise and practical wisdom, and he felt a surge of hope as she examined the factory building with obvious interest. "This is quite a facility," she said as Daniel led her through the main entrance. "Your great-uncle obviously knew what he was doing when it came to industrial design. The layout is very efficient, and the infrastructure looks solid." Daniel guided her to the archives room, where he had spent the morning organizing Ezra's research files into a logical presentation. Professor Vasquez settled at the table and began reading through the documents with the focused intensity that Daniel remembered from her classroom lectures. For nearly 2 hours, she read in silence, occasionally making notes on a pad she had brought with her or asking Daniel to clarify some aspect of the documentation. Her expression remained neutral, giving no hint of her assessment of what she was reviewing. Finally, she set down the last file and looked up at Daniel with an expression that he couldn't quite read. "Daniel," she said slowly, "your great-uncle was a remarkable man. What he developed here represents some of the most advanced thinking about automated manufacturing that I've ever seen. The integration of artificial intelligence with robotic production systems, the quality control protocols, the efficiency algorithms. This is all cutting-edge technology, even by today's standards." Daniel felt his heart racing. "So you think it could work? The process could actually do what he claimed?" "More than that," Professor Vasquez said, her voice taking on an excited edge. "I think it could be revolutionary. The cost projections look realistic, the technical specifications are sound, and the potential applications go far beyond automotive parts. This could be adapted for all kinds of manufacturing processes." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "But Daniel, you need to understand what you're dealing with here. This isn't just some interesting research project. If these plans are as viable as they appear to be, you're potentially sitting on intellectual property worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The number hit Daniel like a physical blow. Hundreds of millions of dollars. It was an amount of money so large that he couldn't even comprehend it, let alone imagine himself being responsible for it. "What would I need to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "To make this real, I mean. To actually implement Ezra's process." Professor Vasquez considered the question carefully. "First, you'd need to complete the development work that your great-uncle started. According to these files, he got about 80% of the way to a finished system before running out of resources. The remaining work would require significant investment in engineering talent and prototype development. How significant? Probably $2 to $3 million, minimum. And that's just to get to the point where you could demonstrate a working system. Actually building a production facility and scaling up to commercial operations would require much more." Daniel's heart sank. $2 to $3 million might as well have been $2 to $3 billion, given his current financial situation. He had less than $3,000 in his checking account, and a credit score that made loan applications a joke. But Professor Vasquez wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "there are ways to raise that kind of money if you can prove that the technology works. Venture capital firms, government grants for advanced manufacturing, strategic partnerships with existing companies. There are options for someone with a breakthrough technology. But they'd want to work with someone who knows what they're doing," Daniel said. "Someone with a business background, engineering credentials, a track record of success. Not a guy who loads trucks for a living." Professor Vasquez studied him for a long moment. "Daniel, Do you remember what I used to tell my students about the most important qualification for an engineer? Daniel searched his memory. You said it wasn't intelligence or education or experience. You said it was the willingness to keep trying when everyone else gives up. Exactly. And from what I can see here, your great-uncle had that quality in abundance. The question is, do you? The question haunted Daniel for the rest of the day. After Professor Vasquez left, promising to research potential funding sources and technical partnerships, Daniel found himself wandering through the factory again, trying to imagine it filled with the hum of advanced machinery and the purposeful activity of skilled workers. But every time he allowed himself to dream about the possibilities, reality crashed back in. He was Daniel Hartwell, high school graduate, community college dropout, loading dock worker. He lived in a studio apartment and drove a car with 200,000 miles on the odometer. What business did he have thinking he could build a multi-million-dollar manufacturing operation? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Daniel was preparing to leave the factory that evening, he heard voices coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Thinking that someone might have broken in, he moved cautiously toward the sound, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What he found instead were three elderly men standing in the middle of the main production floor, talking quietly among themselves. They appeared to be in their 70s or 80s, and something about their comfortable familiarity with the space suggested they belonged here in a way that Daniel still didn't. "Excuse me," Daniel called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Can I help you with something?" The three men turned toward him, their expressions curious but not hostile. The tallest of them, a man with white hair and shoulders that had once been powerful, stepped forward with a slight smile. "You must be Daniel," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Frank Kowalski, Mike's father. We worked here back in the day. Hope you don't mind us taking a look around." The door was open, and we couldn't resist. Daniel shook Frank's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of decades of skilled labor. "Of course I don't mind. Actually, I'd love to hear about what this place was like when it was running." The other two men introduced themselves as Henry Chin and Robert Williams, and as they began sharing their memories of the factory's heyday, Daniel realized he was receiving an education that no business school could provide. These men had been part of Hartwell Manufacturing for decades, had watched it grow and evolve, had understood its rhythms and processes in ways that no outsider ever could. "Your great-uncle was a good man," Frank said as they walked through the production areas. "Tough when he needed to be, but fair. He knew every job in this place, could step in and do the work himself if someone called in sick." "He used to walk the floor every morning," Henry added. "Not like he was checking up on us, just staying connected to what was happening. If you had a problem, personal or professional, Ezra would listen." "The day he announced the closure," Robert said quietly, "there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Not because we were surprised, we'd all seen the writing on the wall, but because we knew how much it was killing him to let us go." As they talked, Daniel began to understand that what he had inherited was more than just a building and some equipment. He had inherited a legacy of craftsmanship, a tradition of quality, a connection to the community that went far deeper than mere employment. "What do you think about the idea of reopening the factory?" Daniel asked as they completed their circuit of the production floor. The three men exchanged glances, and Daniel could see hope flickering in their eyes, even as they tried to maintain realistic expectations. "It would be wonderful if it could work," Frank said carefully. "But the world's changed a lot since we were here. The competition that killed us before is still out there, probably stronger than ever." "What if there was a way to compete?" Daniel asked. "What if there was new technology that could level the playing field?" Henry's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of technology?" Daniel found himself describing Ezra's research, the advanced manufacturing processes, the potential for cost-competitive production. As he talked, he could see the three men becoming more animated, their professional instincts engaging with the possibilities he was describing. "If that's true," Robert said slowly, "if there's really a way to make it work economically, then hell yes, this place should be running again. This town needs those jobs, and there are plenty of skilled workers who'd love to come back. But it would take someone who understands the business," Frank added. "Someone who knows manufacturing, who can work with engineers and investors and all the rest. Daniel felt the familiar weight of his own limitations settling on his shoulders. Yeah, that's the problem. I don't know anything about running a business, especially something this complex. Frank studied him for a long moment. You know, your great-uncle didn't know much about business when he took over from his father. He was an engineer, good with machines and processes, but the business side was all new to him. How did he learn? Same way anybody learns anything important, Henry said with a smile. He asked a lot of questions, made a lot of mistakes, and kept trying until he got it right. And he surrounded himself with people who knew things he didn't. People like us, Robert added. We didn't just work here, Daniel. We were part of making this place successful. Ezra listened to our ideas, respected our experience, treated us like partners instead of just employees. As the three men prepared to leave, Frank turned back to Daniel with a serious expression. I don't know if what you're thinking about is possible or not. But if you decide to try, if you really want to bring this place back to life, you've got people in this town who'd be willing to help. People who remember what it was like to be proud of what we did for a living. After they left, Daniel stood alone in the gathering darkness of the factory floor, their words echoing in his mind. For the first time since discovering Ezra's research, he began to think about the human dimension of what he was contemplating. This wasn't just about technology, or business, or money. It was about giving people hope, about restoring dignity to honest work, about proving that American manufacturing could find a way to compete in the modern world. That night, Daniel barely slept. He lay on his Murphy bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. By morning, he had made a decision that would have seemed insane just a week earlier. He was going to try to bring Hartwell Manufacturing back to life. The first step was quitting his job at the loading dock, something that prompted a conversation with his supervisor that Daniel would remember for years to come. You're making a mistake, Hartwell, Joe Martinez said as Daniel cleaned out his locker. I've seen guys chase get-rich-quick schemes before. They always end up back here, broke and embarrassed, begging for their old jobs back. This isn't a get-rich-quick scheme, Joe. This is about trying to build something that matters. Joe shook his head sadly. You're a good worker, Daniel. Reliable, honest, never gave me any trouble. But you're not a businessman. You're setting yourself up for failure, and when it happens, it's going to hurt worse than you can imagine. Daniel understood Joe's concerns, and part of him agreed with the assessment. But as he walked out of the loading dock for the last time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absence of regret. For once in his life, he was moving towards something, instead of just away from his problems. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that would have been unimaginable to the Daniel who had opened that first letter from the law firm. Working with Professor Vasquez, he began reaching out to potential investors, engineering firms, and manufacturing consultants, trying to build the team that would be necessary to evaluate and develop Ezra's technology. The responses were mixed. Some potential partners dismissed him immediately upon learning about his background, unwilling to take seriously a proposal from someone without credentials or capital. But others were intrigued by the technology itself, impressed by the sophistication of Ezra's research, and willing to consider the possibility that innovation could come from unexpected sources. The breakthrough came from Marcus Chen, Henry's nephew, who had left Millbrook after college to become a successful venture capitalist in Chicago. When Henry told him about Daniel's plans, Marcus had initially been skeptical. But after reviewing Ezra's research files, he became convinced that the technology represented a genuine opportunity. I've seen a lot of manufacturing technologies over the years, Marcus told Daniel during their first phone conversation. Most of them are incremental improvements on existing processes. What your great-uncle developed is different. It's a fundamental rethinking of how automated production can work. Marcus arranged for a team of independent engineers to evaluate the technical feasibility of Ezra's plans, a process that took nearly 2 months and cost Daniel most of his remaining savings. But the results were everything he had hoped for and more. The technology is not only viable, the lead engineer reported, it's potentially revolutionary. With some additional development work, this process could be adapted for a wide range of manufacturing applications. The initial investment required would be substantial, but the potential returns are enormous. Armed with that validation, Marcus began the process of raising the capital necessary to move forward. He structured the deal as a partnership, with Daniel retaining majority ownership of the intellectual property while bringing in investors who could provide the financial resources and business expertise necessary for success. The legal paperwork alone was overwhelming, filled with terms and concepts that Daniel struggled to understand despite hours of explanation from lawyers and accountants. But gradually the structure began to take shape. Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing would be a new company, built on Ezra's technology, designed to bring high-tech production back to American soil. As news of the project began to spread through Millbrook, reactions were predictably mixed. Some people were excited by the possibility of new jobs and economic revival. Others were skeptical, having been disappointed too many times by promises of development that never materialized. But the harshest criticism came from Daniel's own family, who saw his efforts as proof of his fundamental unsuitability for anything requiring real responsibility. "You're embarrassing yourself, Daniel," Sarah said during a tense family dinner that had been supposed to celebrate the progress of the project. "And you're embarrassing all of us. People are talking about how Daniel Hartwell thinks he's going to save the town with some crazy scheme." "It's not a crazy scheme," Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "We have legitimate investors, professional engineers, and technology that's been independently validated." Rick laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. "Come on, Danny. You think some Chicago money guys are going to trust you with millions of dollars? They're probably planning to push you out the minute they get control of whatever it is they really want." The accusation stung because Daniel had wondered about the same thing. He was the least qualified person at every meeting, the one who needed the most explanation of basic business concepts, the obvious weak link in a chain of professionals and experts. But Marcus Chen had addressed those concerns directly during one of their planning sessions. "Daniel, I want you to understand something. This project works because you're involved, not in spite of it. You're not just the owner of the intellectual property. You're the connection to the community, the bridge between the technology and the people who will make it successful. I don't understand. Manufacturing isn't just about machines and processes," Marcus explained. "It's about people and trust and the kind of relationships that can't be built with money alone. Your great-uncle understood that, and it's why he was successful for so many years. The workers respected him because he respected them, because he was one of them in a way that outsiders could never be. But I'm not Ezra. I don't have his experience or his knowledge." "No, but you have something just as valuable. You have the willingness to try, and the humility to learn from people who know more than you do. That's rarer than you might think in the business world." As the project moved forward, Daniel began to understand what Marcus meant. The technical aspects of the manufacturing process were beyond his expertise, but the human elements were not. When they needed to recruit experienced workers, Daniel knew who to call. When they needed to navigate local regulations and zoning requirements, Daniel understood the political landscape. When they needed to build community support for the project, Daniel could speak the language of people who had been forgotten by previous economic development efforts. Most importantly, Daniel represented something that resonated with potential employees and community leaders. The possibility that success could come from within, that Millbrook could save itself rather than waiting for salvation from outside. The first major milestone came 8 months after Daniel had discovered Ezra's research files. Working with a team of engineers and technicians, they had successfully built and tested a prototype of the advanced manufacturing system. The initial results exceeded even their most optimistic projections, with production costs coming in below target and quality levels that surpassed anything the original factory had achieved. "This is it," Professor Vasquez said as they watched the prototype system produce a complex automotive component with machine-like precision. "This is what American manufacturing needs to compete in the global economy." But even as Daniel celebrated the technical success, he was acutely aware of how much work remained. Building a prototype was one thing. Scaling up to full production would require millions of dollars in additional investment, hundreds of skilled workers, and a level of operational expertise that he was still struggling to develop. The challenges seemed overwhelming, but for the first time in his life, Daniel Hartwell was not facing them alone. He had partners who believed in the vision, advisors who were committed to his success, and a community that was beginning to hope that better days might actually be possible. Standing in the restored corner of the factory, where the prototype system hummed with quiet efficiency, Daniel thought about his great-uncle, and the dreams that had died with the original plant's closure. Ezra had fought a lonely battle against forces too powerful to overcome, sacrificing everything he had in a futile attempt to preserve something precious. But perhaps Ezra's sacrifice had not been in vain. Perhaps it had simply been premature, a down payment on a future that was only now becoming possible. The technology existed, the market opportunity was real, and the people of Millbrook were ready to prove that American manufacturing could rise again. The question was whether Daniel Hartwell, despite all his limitations and inexperience, could be the leader that this moment required. The answer, he was beginning to understand, would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever believed that honest work and innovative thinking could triumph over the forces of economic inevitability. The crisis came on a rainy Thursday morning in October, 18 months after Daniel had first walked into the abandoned factory. He was reviewing production schedules in the temporary office they had set up in the restored administrative building when Marcus Chen called with news that made his blood run cold. "We have a problem, Daniel. A big one. Johnson Manufacturing just filed for bankruptcy, and they were supposed to be our anchor customer. Without their orders, we're looking at a 40% shortfall in projected revenue for the first year." Daniel sank into his chair, staring out at the construction crews who were installing the final pieces of equipment in what would soon be Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing's first production line. 6 months of preparation, millions of dollars in investment, and the hopes of nearly 200 people who had already been hired, all suddenly hanging in the balance. "What are our options?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We can try to find replacement customers, but that could take months, and we need confirmed orders to satisfy the loan requirements. Without them, the bank could call in the construction financing, and we'd be forced to shut down before we even start production." The irony was devastating. After overcoming every technical challenge, after proving that Ezra's manufacturing process could work exactly as designed, after building a team of skilled workers and experienced managers, the project was about to fail for the same reason that had killed the original factory. Not enough customers willing to pay American prices for American-made products. Daniel spent the rest of the day in a fog of disbelief and growing panic. He walked through the factory floor, looking at the sophisticated equipment that represented the culmination of his great-uncle's vision. At the workstations, where people he had personally recruited were preparing to begin the most advanced manufacturing operation in the region's history. The idea that it might all disappear because of a single customer's financial problems seemed like a cosmic joke. That evening, he drove home through the darkened streets of Millbrook, past the houses where his future employees lived, past the businesses that had been counting on the economic boost that the reopened factory would provide. How could he tell Frank Kowalski that his son Mike might not have a job after all? How could he face Professor Vasquez, who had invested so much time and credibility in supporting his vision? Most painful of all, how could he face himself, knowing that he had raised hopes that he ultimately couldn't deliver on? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Daniel pulled into the parking lot of his apartment building, he found Sarah waiting by his car, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. They went up to Daniel's apartment, which had barely changed since he had inherited the factory. He had been too busy with the project to think about upgrading his living situation, and the contrast between his modest surroundings and the millions of dollars he was responsible for managing had never seemed more stark. Sarah looked around the small space with an expression that was hard to read. "I heard about Johnson Manufacturing," she said. "Rick has connections in that industry. He told me what it means for your project." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak without his voice breaking. "I also heard something else," Sarah continued. "I heard that you turned down a buyout offer from Tech Global Industries. $20 million for Ezra's technology with a guaranteed management position for you." The offer had come 3 months earlier, when word about Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing's innovations had begun to spread through industry circles. Tech Global's representatives had been smooth and professional, explaining how they could implement Ezra's technology on a global scale, how Daniel could benefit financially while avoiding the risks of actually running a manufacturing operation. "I did turn it down," Daniel said quietly. "Why? You could have been set for life. No risk, no stress, no chance of failure." Daniel thought about the question, trying to find words for feelings that had become clearer over the months of struggle and growth. "Because it wasn't about the money, Sarah. It was never about the money." "Then what was it about?" It was about proving that places like Millbrook matter, that people who work with their hands deserve good jobs and decent wages, that American manufacturing doesn't have to surrender to foreign competition if we're willing to innovate and fight for it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying her brother with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You've changed," she said finally. "Have I?" The Daniel I knew 6 months ago would have taken that deal in a heartbeat. He would have seen it as the smart, safe choice. "But you're not that person anymore, are you?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "I don't know, maybe I'm just stubborn. Maybe I'm too proud to admit that I'm in over my head. Or maybe," Sarah said slowly, "you've found something worth fighting for." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, setting it on the small table between them. Rick's firm represents several automotive suppliers who are looking for domestic partners, companies that are tired of dealing with overseas logistics, quality control issues, and supply chain disruptions. I asked him to make some calls. Daniel picked up the card, reading the name of a company he recognized from industry publications. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was wrong about you," Sarah said, her voice softer than he had heard it in years. "I spent so long seeing you as the family failure that I couldn't recognize when you became something else. But watching you these past months, seeing how hard you've worked, how many people believe in what you're doing, I realized something." "What's that?" "You're not trying to prove anything to us anymore. You're trying to prove something to yourself. And maybe that's what real success looks like." The meeting that Sarah's connection arranged took place the following Tuesday at the factory itself. Daniel had learned that potential customers were more impressed by seeing the operation firsthand than by any presentation or proposal. So he had made the partially completed production line the centerpiece of his sales strategy. The delegation from Midwest Automotive Solutions included their chief executive, their head of procurement, and their lead quality engineer. They were exactly the kind of serious, experienced professionals who had once intimidated Daniel into silence. But 18 months of running a complex project had given him confidence in his ability to speak their language. "What we're offering," Daniel explained as they walked through the facility, "isn't just another supplier relationship. It's a partnership with a manufacturing process that can deliver higher quality at competitive costs, with the reliability and responsiveness that only domestic production can provide." The chief executive, a woman named Linda Rodriguez, who had built her company from a small machine shop into a major automotive supplier, stopped at one of the advanced manufacturing stations and watched the demonstration with obvious interest. "I've heard about this technology," she said. "There were rumors that someone in this area had developed something revolutionary, but I assumed it was just industry gossip." "It's real," Daniel said, his voice carrying the conviction that came from months of testing and refinement. "And it works exactly as advertised. We can produce parts to tolerances that exceed industry standards, with cycle times that match or beat overseas competitors, and with the flexibility to handle custom orders that larger facilities can't accommodate." The quality engineer ran several tests on sample parts, comparing them to specifications with instruments that measured precision to the micron level. His expression grew increasingly impressed as the results confirmed everything Daniel had claimed. "This is remarkable work," he said. "How did you develop this process?" Daniel told them about Ezra, about the years of research that had been abandoned when the original factory closed, about the community of skilled workers who had preserved their expertise through 2 decades of economic decline. He spoke about the vision of American manufacturing that could compete not by cutting wages or corners, but by being smarter, more innovative, and more responsive to customer needs. By the end of the tour, Linda Rodriguez was ready to talk about specifics. The contract they eventually negotiated was larger than the one that had been lost with Johnson Manufacturing, with built-in growth provisions that could double the volume within 2 years if performance targets were met. More importantly, Rodriguez introduced Daniel to other potential customers, executives who were eager to find reliable domestic suppliers for their own operations. Within 6 months, Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing had a customer base that exceeded their original projections, with waiting lists for production capacity that wouldn't be available for another year. The success attracted attention from sources Daniel had never anticipated. A documentary crew arrived from a national news network, wanting to tell the story of American manufacturing's renaissance. Economic development officials from other states tried to recruit the company to relocate, offering tax incentives and subsidies that dwarfed anything Millbrook could provide. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, as Daniel was reviewing plans for the factory's second production line. "Mr. Hartwell, this is Janet Morrison from the Commerce Department in Washington. The Secretary would like to invite you to participate in a roundtable discussion on the future of American manufacturing. Your company has become something of a model for the kind of innovation we're trying to encourage." The roundtable took place in a conference room that Daniel would have found intimidating just 2 years earlier. Seated around a polished table were CEOs of major corporations, leaders of manufacturing associations, and government officials whose decisions affected millions of jobs across the country. Daniel found himself speaking about lessons he had learned not in business school, but in the daily practice of building something from nothing, of turning abandoned dreams into productive reality, of proving that American workers could compete with anyone in the world if they were given the tools and opportunities to succeed. "The key insight," he told the assembled group, "is that we can't compete by racing to the bottom. We have to compete by racing to the top, by being so much better at innovation, quality, and customer service that price becomes just one factor among many." After the meeting, the Secretary of Commerce pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation. "I've been following your story, Mr. Hartwell. What you've accomplished in Millbrook is exactly the kind of success we need to see replicated across the country. Have you given any thought to expanding beyond automotive parts?" Daniel had given considerable thought to expansion, but his focus had always been on growing the existing operation rather than diversifying into new markets. The idea of becoming a model for other communities, other industries, was both exciting and daunting. "What did you have in mind?" "We're developing a program to support advanced manufacturing initiatives in economically distressed areas. Your success could be the template for bringing high-tech production back to communities that have been left behind by economic change." The conversation planted seeds that would eventually grow into the Hartwell Institute for Advanced Manufacturing, a combination research facility, training center, and business incubator that would help other entrepreneurs and communities replicate the success that had transformed Millbrook. But that was still in the future. In the present, Daniel was focused on the immediate challenges of running a rapidly growing business, managing hundreds of employees, and maintaining the delicate balance between growth and sustainability that determined whether success would be temporary or permanent. The most satisfying moment came on a crisp morning in November. Exactly 2 years after he had first walked into the abandoned factory, Daniel stood in his great-uncle's old office, looking out over a production floor that hummed with purposeful activity. 3 shifts of workers operated the advanced manufacturing systems that Ezra had envisioned, producing components that would find their way into vehicles manufactured across North America. Frank Kowalski appeared in the doorway, wearing the blue coveralls of a shift supervisor and carrying a clipboard that had become as much a part of his identity as his years of experience. "Morning, Daniel. Thought you'd like to know that we just hit our production target for the month, with 3 days to spare." Daniel smiled, remembering the first time Frank had called him by his first name instead of Mr. Hartwell. It had taken months to convince the older workers that he wanted to be seen as a colleague rather than a boss, that the factory's success depended on everyone's contributions rather than any individual's authority. "How's the new equipment performing?" "Like a dream. Your great-uncle would be proud of what you built here." The comment brought a familiar tightness to Daniel's throat. Ezra had never lived to see his vision realized, never knew that his years of research and sacrifice had ultimately produced exactly the result he had hoped for, but his presence was felt throughout the facility, in the advanced technology that bore his innovations, in the culture of craftsmanship and continuous improvement that guided every decision. That afternoon, Daniel received a call that brought the story full circle in a way he could never have anticipated. "Mr. Hartwell, this is Margaret Morrison. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." The elderly lawyer's voice carried a note of excitement that was unusual for someone who had spent decades delivering routine legal information. "I've been going through some additional papers from your great-uncle's estate, documents that were stored in a safety deposit box we only recently discovered. It appears that Ezra was more prescient than any of us realized." "What do you mean?" He anticipated that his technology might someday be successfully implemented, and he made provisions for that possibility. There are detailed instructions for the establishment of a foundation that would use profits from the manufacturing process to support education, job training, and economic development in communities affected by industrial decline. Margaret paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "According to the documents, he designated you as the sole trustee of this foundation, with full authority to determine how its resources should be used. Based on current projections of your company's profitability, we're talking about an endowment that could eventually reach several $100 million. Daniel sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. Ezra had somehow known that his great-nephew would not only implement the technology, but would do so in a way that created wealth beyond anything either of them had imagined. More than that, he had trusted Daniel to use that wealth responsibly, to remember where it came from and what it was meant to accomplish. The foundation would become Daniel's most important legacy, funding manufacturing education programs in dozens of communities, supporting research into advanced production technologies, and providing seed capital for entrepreneurs who shared Ezra's vision of American industrial renewal. But on that November afternoon, as Daniel walked through the factory that had once been nothing more than a monument to failure, he was thinking not about the future but about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years earlier, he had been Daniel Hartwell, loading dock worker, family disappointment, a man with no particular skills or prospects. The inheritance of an abandoned factory had seemed like just another burden, another reminder of his inability to measure up to other people's expectations. Instead, it had become the foundation for a transformation that went far beyond business success or financial gain. Daniel had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed, had learned to lead people who had more experience and expertise than he did, had proven that vision and determination could sometimes overcome the limitations of background and education. More importantly, he had learned that success was not about proving something to other people, but about finding something worth dedicating your life to achieving. The mockery of his family had stung because it contained elements of truth, but it had also motivated him to become someone worthy of the trust that Ezra had placed in him. Standing in the office where his great-uncle had once wrestled with impossible choices, Daniel understood that he had inherited more than just a building or a technology. He had inherited a responsibility to the community, to the workers, to the idea that American manufacturing could find a way to thrive in a changed world. The abandoned factory had become a symbol of hope, not just for Millbrook, but for communities across the country, where similar stories of decline and renewal were waiting to be written. The $400 million secret that Ezra had hidden in his research files was not just about money or technology, but about the power of human ingenuity to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As Daniel prepared to leave the office that evening, he noticed a framed photograph on the credenza that he had never seen before. It showed Ezra as a young man, standing in front of the original factory building with a group of workers from the 1950s. Everyone in the picture was smiling, their faces bright with the confidence that came from building something meaningful. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note in Ezra's distinctive script. "For Daniel, may you find the strength to finish what we started." Somehow, his great-uncle had known that the story was not ending with the factory's closure, but was simply waiting for the right person to write the next chapter. Daniel had become that person, not because he was the most qualified or the most experienced, but because he was willing to try when everyone else had given up. The factory's transformation from abandoned ruin to advanced manufacturing center had taken 2 years, millions of dollars, and the combined efforts of hundreds of people. But it had begun with a simple decision to believe that failure was not the end of the story, that with enough persistence and creativity, even the most discouraging circumstances could be overcome. As Daniel locked the office door and walked across the parking lot to his car, he could hear the sounds of the night shift beginning their work, the quiet hum of sophisticated machinery producing components that would help power America's economic future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities for growth and expansion. But tonight, Daniel Hartwell was content to drive home through the streets of Millbrook, past the houses where his employees lived, past the businesses that were thriving again because of the jobs the factory provided, past the school where children were learning that their hometown was a place where dreams could come true if you were willing to work for them. The family that had once mocked his inheritance would never fully understand what he had accomplished, but that no longer mattered. Daniel had found something more valuable than their approval. He had found himself, and in doing so, he had discovered that the most important inheritance was not what Ezra had left him, but what he had chosen to do with it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.